June 6, 1944, early morning, Normandy coast. The sea is gray and restless beneath a low ceiling of cloud. Waves break against twisted steel obstacles planted deep into the sand. On the bluffs above, German sentries brace against the wind, scanning a horizon that only hours earlier had seemed empty. Now it is crowded with shapes, hundreds of them, landing craft, warships, and armada without end. Along the Atlantic wall, telephones begin ringing at once. Radar stations light up. Flares rise into the morning gloom. Artillery crews scramble to their guns as distant thunder grows closer with every passing minute. This is not a raid. This is not a diversion. This is the invasion. Miles away, General Erwin Rommel is not at his headquarters. He is in Germany, visiting his family. The Field Marshal who had spent months preparing for this moment is absent as the first American waves strike the beaches. By the time Rommel will see Normandy again, the beaches will already be in Allied hands. The ports will be pouring men and machines into France. The sky will belong to the enemy. And in the days that follow, as he takes in the scale of what has unfolded, one truth will become impossible to escape. Germany's fate has already been sealed. When Erwin Rommel was assigned to inspect and later help command the defenses of Western Europe in late 1943, the war had already turned against Germany. The Eastern Front was bleeding the Wehrmacht dry. Allied bombers were tearing holes in German industry night after night. Italy had fallen out of the Axis. What remained uncertain, what still held the potential to change everything, was where the inevitable Allied return to France would strike, and whether it could be stopped at the shoreline. Rommel believed it could, but only under one condition. He was convinced that once the Allies secured a firm foothold on French soil, Germany would never again be able to dislodge them. Allied air power, naval gunfire, and overwhelming industrial logistics would make any inland counterattack impossible. For Rommel, the invasion had to be crushed within the first hours, on the sand itself, not behind the beaches, not days later, immediately. This put him on a collision course with the German High Command. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, overall commander in the West, believed Germany's best hope lay in holding powerful mobile panzer reserves inland and launching a massive counterstroke once the true invasion point was revealed. Rommel argued that air superiority had already made that doctrine obsolete. Allied aircraft dominated the skies by day. German armor moving toward the coast would be detected, bombed, and shattered before it ever reached the battlefield. Their disagreement was not theoretical. It shaped the entire structure of Germany's Atlantic wall. Rommel pushed relentlessly for dense minefields, concrete obstacles, anti-landing stakes, flooded lowlands, and heavy infantry positions directly at the coast. He wanted every beach turned into a killing ground before the first American soldier reached dry sand. Rundstedt and others wanted depth and maneuver. Hitler decided the argument in the worst possible way. He split the authority. Some panzer divisions were placed near the coast under Rommel's nominal influence. Others remained under OKW control as a strategic reserve that only Hitler himself could release. This ensured one thing with absolute certainty. When the invasion came, no unified German response would be possible in the crucial opening hours. Meanwhile, the Allies were conducting the largest deception campaign in military history. Operation Fortitude constructed an entire phantom army under General George Patton in southeastern England. Fake landing craft filled harbors. Dummy tanks appeared in fields. False radio traffic created the illusion of massive formations aimed directly at the Pas-de-Calais, the shortest route across the Channel. German intelligence accepted the deception. It fit their expectations. It matched their logic. They became convinced that Normandy was merely a diversion. Rommel himself was troubled by this assumption, but even he was torn between conflicting signals. The Calais coast was closer. It made sense as the invasion point. Normandy, farther west, seemed less logical for a main effort. By the spring of 1944, Rommel's men had worked relentlessly. Millions of mines were laid. Obstacles bristled along the beaches. Strong points rose around coastal villages. Yet critical weaknesses remained. Germany lacked air power in the west. Fuel shortages restricted training. Veteran divisions had been transferred east. New units were undertrained and poorly supplied. And most dangerously, the Panzer Reserve, the only force capable of crushing a beachhead, remained locked behind Hitler's personal authority. On the night of June 5, 1944, Rommel left his headquarters to Germany. The weather was worsening. Allied air activity had declined slightly. Many German commanders believed no invasion was imminent. Rommel intended to visit his wife for her birthday. It was a human decision in a war that allowed little room for them. Within hours, Allied paratroopers would be dropping into the darkness behind German lines. Naval guns would be turning the coast into flame. And the decisions made in Berlin about deception, about reserves, about authority would begin to exact their final and irreversible cost. Shortly after midnight on June 6, 1944, the illusion of calm in German headquarters across France began to fracture. Reports trickled in slowly at first. Unusual aircraft noise inland, scattered parachutes, brief fights in the dark. To many officers, these early alerts seemed to confirm long-held assumptions about Allied tactics. Diversionary airborne drops meant to confuse and distract ahead of the real landing at the Pas-de-Calais. What followed was fatal hesitation. German radar detected large formations in the channel, but cloud cover and electronic interference made precise identification difficult. Naval lookouts reported shapes on the horizon, but the scale was hard to grasp. In several command posts, officers hesitated to wake senior commanders for what still appeared to be scattered, uncertain reports. The possibility that Normandy itself was the main invasion point seemed, even in those early hours, to contradict months of expectation. At the heart of this paralysis was Adolf Hitler's command structure. Under standing orders, the release of major armored reserves required Hitler's personal authorization. No field commander, not Rundstedt, not even the commanders of the panzer divisions themselves could move those formations without approval. When the invasion alarms intensified in the early hours of June 6th, multiple requests for release were sent up the chain. They stalled. Hitler was asleep. His staff hesitated to wake him without absolute certainty. By the time authorization finally came, precious hours had vanished. On the beaches, those hours were everything. At Utah, American forces landed against comparatively weak resistance and pushed inland rapidly. At Omaha, resistance was fierce, and in the early morning hours, the landings teetered on the edge of failure. Yet even there, German artillery positions were isolated and suppressed by overwhelming naval gunfire. Offshore, battleships and cruisers poured steel into the bluffs. Any German movement detected by Allied spotters was struck within minutes. Above it all, the sky belonged entirely to the Allies. German aircraft made only scattered appearances. Fuel shortages, airfield damage, and Allied fighter patrols reduced the Luftwaffe to near irrelevance on the first day of the invasion. For Rommel's greatest fear, the inability to move armor under Allied air attack was already becoming reality before the panzers even began to roll. When Rommel returned to Normandy on June 6th, the invasion was no longer a question. It was a fact. It carved into the coastline. He drove through columns of wounded men, shattered vehicles, and retreating infantry units trying to reform under constant air attack. What he saw confirmed his darkest warnings. The beaches were not merely contested. They were already being transformed into permanent Allied ports of entry. Engineers were clearing exits. Supply dumps were forming. Units were rotating forward. The machinery of invasion, once established, was feeding itself. Rommel's hopes now rested on one narrow thread. that a concentrated panzer counterattack launched immediately and with overwhelming force might still drive the Allies back into the sea. But the delays had been catastrophic. Divisions reached the front piecemeal. Fuel shortages slowed movements. Allied aircraft shredded German columns on exposed roads. This was no longer the sharp, decisive counterstroke Rommel had envisioned. It was a desperate, fragmented reaction to a landing that had already succeeded. By the end of June 6th, the Allied beachhead was secure at multiple points. Tens of thousands of men were ashore. Heavy equipment was being unloaded under constant naval protection, and the door to France stood open. For Rommel, the meaning was unmistakable. The chance to decide the war in one violent morning had been lost. What followed would now be a war of attrition against an enemy whose strength only grew by the hour.
At Omaha, resistance was fierce in the early hours. Machine guns enfiladed the beach. Mortars cut into the first American waves. Yet even here, German defenders were isolated. Strong points could fight, but they could not maneuver. Once flanked, they were simply bypassed or destroyed by explosives, naval fire, or direct assault. By mid-morning, German survivors were retreating inland through shattered positions, moving without orders, without armor, and without air support. Many had not even seen an American soldier yet, only the firepower that preceded them. For these men, the realization came without political calculation or strategic theory. It came in the simple understanding that they were being overwhelmed by a force far larger than anything they could stop alone. Rommel's warning had been direct. The invasion would be won or lost on the first day. Now, as calls flooded headquarters from across Normandy, his absence and the paralysis of the command system created the very conditions he had feared. Requests for armored support moved slowly through fractured chains of authority. Field commanders hesitated, unsure whether they had the right to act. Orders conflicted. Some panzer elements were released too late. Others waited idle for hours while airborne landings and naval bombardment continued to disrupt roads and communications. Rommel had argued that centralized control was fatal under Allied air superiority. The events of June 6 proved him right in real time. By the time decisive orders finally arrived, the tactical situation had already shifted beyond recovery. Leadership failure here was not a lack of courage. It was a lack of speed. And in modern war, hours could outweigh divisions. Throughout the first day, many German commanders still believed Normandy was not the main invasion. They expected a second, larger landing at Calais. Reports of Allied strength were therefore interpreted as limited successes, not strategic catastrophe. But as night fell on June 6, that illusion began to collapse. Radio traffic showed Allied traffic increasing, not diminishing. Reconfirmed that ports were being constructed directly on the beaches. Allied ships did not withdraw. They multiplied. German officers began to understand that there would be no second landing. This was the landing. Operation Fortitude had succeeded completely. What had once seemed too far west to be the main effort had become the center of gravity of the war in the West. And for many German staff officers, the shock was not simply military. It was psychological. Their expectations had been shaped, manipulated, and then shattered. The war they had prepared for was not the war that had arrived. German doctrine rested on one decisive principle: mobile armored counterattack. Panzer divisions were meant to strike the invaders at their moment of vulnerability, while they were still trapped between sea and shore. But on June 6, that doctrine collided with a battlefield that no longer resembled the wars Germany had mastered earlier. Roads choked with refugees and retreating infantry slowed movement. Bridges were cratered by Allied aircraft. Fuel shortages forced columns to halt and wait. Even when panzer units did begin to move, they were forced to travel at night, halting at dawn to avoid destruction from the air. What should have been a rapid concentration of force became a slow, fragmented crawl. When elements of the 21st Panzer Division finally reached the front near Caen, their attacks lacked coordination. Some units struck alone. Others arrived too late. American and British troops, dug in and reinforced by constant resupply, absorbed the blows and held their ground. The invasion had not been stalled. It had absorbed the very weapon meant to stop it. Rommel had warned repeatedly that Allied air power would make large-scale daytime movement impossible. On June 6, that warning became fact. From dawn onward, Allied aircraft patrolled every road, rail line, and crossroads in northern France. Any movement large enough to matter drew immediate attack. German columns were scattered by rockets and bombs before they ever reached contact with ground forces. Vehicles were destroyed while moving, while halted, and even while camouflaged beneath trees. At sea, naval fire added a second layer of impossibility. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers provided direct fire support from offshore. German batteries that opened fire were rapidly silenced by counter-battery salvos measured not in minutes, but in seconds. The defenders were not merely fighting soldiers on the beach. They were fighting the sky and the sea at the same time. As June turned into July, German units along the Normandy front began to experience the war not as a campaign, but as a grinding erosion of hope. Replacements arrived already exhausted from air attacks on transport routes. Supplies arrived late, if at all. Ammunition grew scarce. Food shortages became routine. The wounded outnumbered the arriving reinforcements. Every attempt to regroup invited immediate Allied fire. Soldiers did not speak of victory anymore. They spoke of survival. Letters home grew cautious. Conversations turned quiet. Officers began to plan retreats rather than advances. The belief that Normandy could be stabilized faded with each passing day. For many German soldiers, the realization became personal and escapable. They were no longer defending Germany's future. They were witnessing its collapse in slow motion. Mid-June 1944, the Norman countryside behind the beaches. Within days of the landings, the invasion had ceased to be a question of survival and become a question of permanence. American and British forces were no longer clinging to the sand. They were expanding outward, field by field, village by village, road by road. The front began to thicken into something heavy and immovable. When Rommel returned fully to the battlefield and began touring the forward sectors, the scale of what he saw cut through every remaining hope of reversal. The beach exits he had feared were already functioning arteries of supply. Roads were choked not with retreating defenders, but with advancing Allied columns. Engineers had laid down temporary harbors. Fuel dumps grew larger by the day. Artillery batteries appeared where none had existed before. The invasion, far from being fragile, had become self-sustaining. Rommel understood what that meant. Once the Allies possessed uninterrupted logistics, Germany's ability to dislodge them evaporated. The mobile counterattack he had envisioned on June 6 was no longer possible. What remained now was only containment. And even that was slipping. German attempts to isolate the beaches had failed. Small counterthrusts struck individual sectors but were rapidly smothered under air attack and artillery. Each failed attack consumed irreplaceable men and machines. Each failure widened the imbalance. American divisions, by contrast, rotated forward continuously. Fresh units moved into the line, wounded were evacuated in minutes. Ammunition arrived in steady volume. The battlefield rhythm favored the attacker completely. Yet the true breaking point was not logistical. It was psychological. By the second week of the invasion, Rommel began receiving reports not framed in terms of objectives, but in terms of limits. Units reported what they could no longer hold. Commanders described positions that could not be reinforced. Armor officers reported fuel shortages even before engagements began. The language of maneuver gave way to the language of delay. and delay was always fatal under Allied air supremacy. Then, in early July, the Americans changed the nature of the battlefield entirely. Massed air power began to be used not only against movement, but against the German front itself. Heavy bombers struck defensive belts near St. Lo. The ground was shattered into dust and craters. Communications dissolved in shock waves. Units positioned beneath the bombardment emerged disoriented, fragmented, and unable to respond coherently. Rommel recognized the pattern instantly. This was not suppression. This was preparation for a breakout. Germany's defensive line, already stretched thin by attrition and paralysis, was about to be tested by a force no tactical adjustment could absorb. The American army was transitioning from invasion to acceleration. Every warning Rommel had issued before D-Day now returned amplified. Air superiority, logistics, unstoppable momentum. He saw clearly that the equation no longer favored defense. But the high command in Berlin had not yet accepted the same conclusion. Orders continued to arrive, demanding local counterattacks, holding ground at all costs, retaking positions already pulverized beyond military value. Units were ordered to stand fast under bombardments that erased them from the map. For Rommel, the strain became unbearable. He understood what was coming. The Americans were not preparing to push. They were preparing to break through. And once they did, what remained of Germany's western defense would unravel with a speed that no command structure, however determined, could reverse. The war in the West was a...
At first light, hundreds of American heavy bombers appeared over German defensive positions west of St. Lo. Waves of B-17s and B-24s dropped their payloads with mechanical precision. The earth convulsed beneath the impact. Entire defensive belts vanished in seconds. Trenches collapsed, vehicles were buried, communications ceased to exist. This was Operation Cobra. For weeks, German forces had held the Americans in the tangled hedgerows of Normandy, terrain that turned every field into a fortress. Progress had been slow and costly, but Cobra was designed to end that stalemate in a single violent rupture. The air assault pulverized the German front before the ground attack even began. When American armored and infantry divisions surged forward behind the bombardment, they encountered only fragments of what had once been a defensive line. Survivors were dazed. Units were scattered. Chain of command, already strained by weeks of attrition, disintegrated under the shock. Within days, the front collapsed. American forces poured through the breach and began fanning outward across open French countryside, terrain far better suited to maneuver warfare than the hemmed-in bocage. Speed returned to the battlefield, and speed, under Allied air dominance, was deadly. German units attempted to reform farther east. They attempted to build new defensive lines along rivers and road junctions. But the moment they concentrated, Allied aircraft struck again. Columns were destroyed while in motion. Supply depots exploded before they could be dispersed. Fuel convoys never reached the front. On July 17, only days before Cobra began, Rommel had been severely wounded when his staff car was strafed by an Allied fighter near Livorno. He was thrown from the vehicle by the blast. A fractured skull removed him from command at the precise moment Germany most needed clarity and direction. With Rommel gone, the last voice that fully grasped the magnitude of the unfolding catastrophe fell silent. After Cobra, the German retreat became general. American and British forces raced south and east, threatening to encircle entire German armies still struggling to disengage from Normandy. By August, the situation had transformed from retreat to trap. The jaws closed at Falaise. Inside the narrowing pocket, German formations disintegrated. Thousands of vehicles were destroyed on roads clogged with wreckage. Horse-drawn supply wagons burned beside tanks. Infantry streamed through fields under constant air attack. The once ordered Wehrmacht dissolved into columns of exhausted men fleeing without cohesion. Only fragments escaped. For Germany, the loss was catastrophic. Veteran divisions were annihilated. Command structures collapsed. Equipment losses reached levels that could never be replaced. What remained of the Western Front ceased to be a continuous line of resistance. It became a series of desperate delays along rivers and urban ruins. The illusion that Normandy could be contained had vanished completely. As the Allies surged across France, Paris fell within weeks. Supply lines stretched not from fragile beaches, but from fully functioning ports. The logistical engine Rommel had feared was now unhindered. For Germany, the moment of reversal was unmistakable. D-Day had opened the door. Cobra had shattered the frame, and Falaise had torn the hinges free. From that point forward, there would be no return to equilibrium in the West. There would be no restoration of a defensive balance. Only withdrawal, collapse, and the steady approach of the enemy toward Germany's frontiers. For Rommel, removed from the field, injured, sidelined, the realization he had reached in Normandy became historical fact. America's landings had not merely begun a campaign. They had ended the war for Germany in the West. August-September 1944. Across France and into Germany's collapsing western defenses. In the weeks after the destruction at Falaise, the German retreat across France turned into a race against disintegration. What had once been structured withdrawal now became scattered flight under constant pressure. Roads filled with columns of damaged vehicles, wounded soldiers, supply carts, and abandoned equipment. Bridges were blown behind them in desperation. Rivers became temporary lines of survival rather than positions of defense. For the Western Allies, the advance accelerated beyond even their own planning. American armored divisions surged eastward across open country, no longer slowed by hedgerows or continuous defensive belts. French towns fell in rapid succession. Supply lines stretched forward but remained intact, because German interdiction was no longer effective. The Luftwaffe, starved of fuel and overwhelmed by Allied fighters, could no longer contest the skies in meaningful strength. Paris fell in late August. Not as the result of prolonged siege, but as the consequence of a German army that no longer possessed the cohesion to hold it. What remained of German forces retreated toward the Seine, then toward the borders of the Reich itself. Each movement eastward cost them vehicles, fuel, manpower, and command integrity. Behind the lines, Germany's industrial situation worsened in parallel. The loss of France eliminated vital raw materials, factories, and forward repair depots. Transportation networks were shattered by bombing. Fuel shortages deepened. Even units that escaped encirclement struggled to receive ammunition and food in steady quantity. The Wehrmacht in the West was no longer capable of sustained offensive action. For Rommel, the consequences were unfolding away from the front, but the psychological weight remained tied to Normandy. His injuries kept him sidelined as the Western Front collapsed. Removed from command at the decisive hour, he watched the consequences of the invasion unfold without the ability to influence events. The warnings he had issued months earlier about air power, logistics, centralized authority, and the impossibility of stopping a beachhead once established were now being proven with unrelenting finality. Within the German high command, the tone shifted from operational planning to political survival. The assassination attempt against Hitler on July 20 had failed, and its failure tightened the regime's grip on all remaining commanders. Suspicion spread. Loyalty was measured not by battlefield success, but by ideological obedience. Strategic clarity vanished beneath fear. As Allied troops approached Germany's western borders, the idea of restoring a defensive balance in the West was no longer discussed in serious terms. The only question that remained was whether Germany could slow the inevitable long enough to shape the ending. For the German soldiers still fighting, the meaning was stark. They no longer fought to hold France. They no longer fought to prevent invasion. They fought to delay the war's arrival on German soil. Normandy had done more than break a front. It had broken the future Germany's high command had believed still existed. September-October 1944. The war returns to Germany. As Allied forces crossed the borders of the Reich, the strategic consequences of Normandy reached their final stage. What had begun as a desperate attempt to hold the Atlantic coast now ended with foreign armies advancing toward Germany's heartland. The Western Front no longer existed as a fortified shield. It had become a series of improvised barriers thrown up in the path of an enemy that could not be stopped, only slow. German units attempted to reorganize along the West Wall, the old Siegfried line of bunkers and dragon's teeth that had once promised security. But the line had been neglected for years. Fortifications were incomplete. Gun positions lacked ammunition. Crews lacked training. And the Allies, now supported by overwhelming logistics and total air superiority, approached it with the full weight of modern mechanized warfare. Paris fell in late August. Not as the result of prolonged siege, but as the consequence of a German army that no longer possessed the cohesion to hold it. What remained of German forces retreated toward the Seine, then toward the borders of the Reich itself. Each movement eastward cost them vehicles, fuel, manpower, and command integrity. Within the lines, Germany's industrial situation worsened in parallel. The loss of France eliminated vital raw materials, factories, and forward repair depots. Transportation networks were shattered by bombing. Fuel shortages deepened. Even units that escaped encirclement struggled to receive ammunition and food in steady quantity. The Wehrmacht in the West was no longer capable of sustained offensive action. For Rommel, the consequences were unfolding away from the front, but the psychological weight remained tied to Normandy. His injuries kept him sidelined as the Western Front collapsed. Removed from command at the decisive hour, he watched the consequences of the invasion unfold without the ability to influence events. The warnings he had issued months earlier about air power, logistics, centralized authority, and the impossibility of stopping a beachhead once established were now being proven with unrelenting finality. Within the German high command, the tone shifted from operational planning to political survival. The assassination attempt against Hitler on July 20 had failed, and its failure tightened the regime's grip on all remaining commanders. Suspicion spread. Loyalty was measured not by battlefield success, but by ideological obedience. Strategic clarity vanished beneath fear. As Allied troops approached Germany's western borders, the idea of restoring
Normandy's consequences now touched every corner of the war. What had begun on the beaches as a contest of landings and strongpoints had transformed into a systemic collapse of logistics, command, mobility, and belief. The invasion did not merely open a path into France, it opened the path to Germany's defeat. And for those who had watched the Armada rise through the fog on June 6th, the end was no longer a matter of speculation. It was simply a matter of time. The moment the first American soldiers reached the beaches of Normandy, the war in the West entered a new and irreversible phase. What followed was not merely a campaign of movement and counter-movement, but a fundamental transfer of control, of air, sea, logistics, and time itself. For Germany, the landings did more than threaten territory. They shattered the last structure that made resistance in the West possible. Rommel had understood this earlier than most. His fear was never centered on the courage of German soldiers or the strength of its weapons. It was rooted in mathematics, in the imbalance of industry, in the certainty of logistics, in the reality that once the Allies were ashore with secure supply, the contest would no longer be equal. Normandy proved him right with merciless clarity. The Atlantic Wall did not fail because its defenders lacked resolve. The counterattack did not fail because German units lacked bravery. They failed because the modern battlefield had changed beyond the limits of centralized control and static defense. Air supremacy erased movement. Naval fire erased fixed positions. And Allied production erased attrition. Once all three forces aligned, Germany's Western military future collapsed into inevitability.
Rommel's final tragedy was not simply that he was absent on the morning of June 6th, it was that he returned in time to see the result with complete understanding. He saw the supply columns forming. He saw the skies ruled by enemy aircraft. He saw the panzer response broken by delay and exposure. And he knew, quietly, without illusion, that the war he had been tasked to prevent had already been lost. Normandy did not end the war, but it defined its outcome. From that shoreline flowed the liberation of France, the collapse at Falaise, the crossing of the Rhine, and the final battles inside Germany itself. The path from the beaches led straight to Berlin. For Germany, the realization came not in a single dramatic defeat, but in the slow, relentless confirmation that the future no longer belonged to them. And for the world, Normandy became more than a landing. It became the moment history turned its final page on the Third Reich.